During the federal election campaign, the Liberals, who are going to form a minority government, promised just transition legislation. So what might that look like? I'm going to talk to Dr. James Nugent from the University of Waterloo. He joins us from Waterloo. Welcome to the interview, James.
Great, thanks. Nice to be here.
Well, what's your take on what the Liberals are likely to do with this legislation?
Yeah, so, from what I gather, there is a review being done to sort of come up with some just transition policies. I think that, probably the last thing we need is another, policy review or sort of a scan of what just transition is. This idea has been around for, a few decades now. And so it's not really a new concept that requires that kind of high level understanding from a policy perspective. What we really need is actually programs put into place, and we need funding behind those programs. So I actually am of the opinion that, I'm sure we could always use new legislation and policy to try to advance the idea of just transition. But this idea has been around long enough that what we really need is just concrete programs. And I think we have in funding for those programs. And I think we actually already have some very broad programs such as unemployment insurance that could actually be used for something like just transition.
Now, my understanding of just transition, James, is that it means helping workers in fossil fuel industries as those industries wane, or maybe they're even phased out by government policy, that programs are put in place to help them retrain for other jobs. Maybe there's economic development in communities that depend on, say, coal, something like that. Have I got that right?
Yeah, the basic idea of just transition is that when workers' livelihoods are negatively impacted by environmental regulation, that there is supports and plans and programs in place to help those workers transition out of those livelihoods that are no longer sustainable or viable under the new environmental regulation. So that's the basic idea. Although the idea that was sort of its initial idea that sort of emerged from the labor movement through collective bargaining, and but it has actually expanded quite a lot to look at broader things, not only including the transition of workers who might lose their livelihoods as a result of environmental regulation, but also looking at perhaps entire sectors, or looking at even regions, or in some cases countries, or at a global scale. How do we have a just transition in which we take into consideration the economic development needs of the global South, for example?
Now, one of the criticisms that comes up is from the oil and gas industry based out of Alberta, where they and the UCP government headed up by Premier Jason Kenney, where they, as soon as you mention just transition, they immediately talk about the government's plan, federal government's plan with air quotes around it, to dismantle oil and gas. And I don't see a lot of that. I mean, there is an element of that in people who advocate for just transition, but it doesn't strike me that there's a lot of it. What's your take?
Yeah, so I think we have to just look at the reality of where we're at. We have a climate crisis that's not even on the horizon. It's happening right now. We're seeing the effects around the world. And so, we have to transition away from fossil fuels. I mean, that's what we have to do. The question is, how do we do it, and how fast do we do it? And also, what are the distributional impacts of that transition? And I think it's that last question that just transition tries to get into. So, when we hear politicians such as Jason Kenney or others say, resisting any kind of talk around transition or just transition, they're not really facing the reality of this transition that has to happen if we're going to address climate change. And that what they're trying to do is really speak to what I would say legitimate fears of a lot of workers in the oil and gas industries about their livelihoods. And I think that's sort of the power of just transition, if we're doing it right, is to actually come up with very concrete proposals that allow workers to see a pathway forward. Because right now it's not clear. It's not clear if I'm working in the oil and gas industries, what is my future? And, vague notions of just transition actually don't go far enough in alleviating those very real, livelihood concerns of how am I going to pay the mortgage, how I'm going to make the car payments or truck payments. So it's at the very detailed level that I think we need some action.
Well, I think it's fair to say that there, structural changes have taken place in economies before. We think of the changes in American manufacturing and the creation of the Rust Belt in the Midwest, or the decline in coal mining in the places like West Virginia. And very often those communities are simply abandoned, forgotten, they're left to their own devices. And that leads to all sorts of, economic and social problems. And I guess my take in this, is, if I understand it correctly, is that we want to avoid those in Canada. Absolutely. And by taking a just transition approach, because the energy transition is coming for oil and gas one way or another. It might be this decade, it might be 2 decades or 3 decades, but it's coming. There's no question about that. And we want to avoid turning places like Alberta into West Virginia. Yeah. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And, you think of all of the ghost towns that exist around, former mining companies, whether it's in Ontario or maybe it's the sawmill towns in British Columbia, as well as Ontario and other places. And people know that this is what happens when industries no longer become profitable. The capital investments leave that area, and there is no funds for social infrastructure, for physical infrastructure. And communities are abandoned, and so there's a real fear that's exists through the history that workers have faced, and communities have faced when industry leaves, and so that really raises the question, not only about how do we make concrete proposals and programs for just transition, but how do we fund them? And if these are still profitable industries, and they are over a period of time have been extremely profitable in terms of fossil fuel industries, where is the money? Where are the funds that exist for guaranteeing the future, not just of those workers, but of those communities?
Yeah, there was a recent study by Wood Mackenzie, which actually does a lot of oil and gas consulting. It's a big international consultancy. And they made the point that the 2020s are likely to be very profitable for oil and gas. And this is the time when that industry needs to invest in shifting to low carbon business models. And after 2030, the future looks much less certain. There may be prices fall because of oversupply, and then the industry becomes unprofitable, and then it's almost in a death spiral. And so basically it looks like that the 2020s, we have a decade to fix this problem and to address it. And would you agree with that? Time is of the essence?
Yeah, I have a very big concern that there's a massive unfunded liability that these oil and gas companies are holding, both in terms of their legislated requirement to restore or rehabilitate landscapes that they've destroyed, as well as orphaned wells. And where is the money going to come for that when these companies are no longer profitable? And so, we still at this point have oil and gas companies giving out dividends despite the trouble that they've had, and the government subsidies that they've received over the past few years. And so, there is, I think, a very small window here where we need to be actually getting funds from the sector so that it can pay forward and create sustainable livelihoods for those communities and for those workers once these industries are no longer profitable or go bankrupt, as the case might be.
Well, James, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.